You wake to the sound of leather on stone, a soft scrape that carries the weight of a whole empire. It's still dark in the cryptoporticus, the hidden corridor beneath the palace, where the air smells of old lime wash and colder secrets. A torch sputters somewhere behind you, throwing a restless halo across the plastered walls. You pull your cloak tighter and press forward, step after step, the way you have done since childhood, when you learned that survival in Rome is a posture before it is a plan. Above your head, the city is still drowsing, but the beast you serve never sleeps. It only changes rooms. They call you by a name that was never yours. Caligula, little boots, you didn't choose it. Soldiers on the Rhine strapped miniature army sandals to your toddler feet, laughed, and crowned you with a nickname that outlived the men who gave it. Your real inheritance wasn't leather or laughter. It was the echo of a father worshipped like a demigod, and a mother who would rather die than bend. Germanicus, adored by legions, the golden sun whose shadow fell across the entire world. Agrippina the Elder, iron-backed, daring enough to stare down emperors. When you were small, you learned that devotion is a currency in Rome, and every coin is minted with a face someone will one day deface. Then came the island years, Capri, where Tiberius aged into suspicion the way figs age into rot. You grew tall under ceilings that never forgot whispers. Men were tried for jokes, smiles were weighed like daggers. You learned to survive by stillness, a perfect mask that reflected nothing and absorbed everything. When courtiers traded rumors about who would fall next, you remembered the shape of each mouth as carefully as a scribe copies a sacred line. You trained your voice to flatter, your eyes to obey, your pulse to lie. In a palace that fed on confessions, you became the one thing it could not digest: unreadable. You watched your brothers disappear into the grey machinery of imperial mercy. One was accused, another weakened, both extinguished by the logic of fear that makes empires efficient and families expendable. Your mother, too fierce to wilt, was pushed into exile, her stubborn light snuffed out far from the city whose streets she had once commanded simply by walking them. You learned the lesson no tutor dared write on wax. Rome is a theatre where grief is rehearsed offstage and performed in silence. You left Capri not as a boy who survived, but as an instrument sharpened by necessity. Macro, the prefect with eyes that smiled only when calculation was complete, measured you the way an engineer measures a span. How much weight can this beam carry? How much pressure before it snaps? He saw that your stillness wasn't emptiness, but storage. When the old emperor finally loosened his hold on breath, you stepped into a world that had practiced your arrival for years. Senators rehearsed the right angle of bow. Priests dusted old hymns. Crowds retaught their throats to roar. The boy, in little boots, had become the man with the stride that set the rhythm for a continent. In the first mornings, you chose grace like a weapon. You burned records of treason trials, loosed prisoners from cells that smelled of stale dread, returned exiles to daylight and family tables. The city exhaled for the first time in a generation, and you inhaled that gratitude as if it were incense, poured for you by 100 altars. You called it restoration. They called it hope. The truth is simpler. You understood that the most dangerous enemy of a new ruler is memory. So you purchased forgetfulness at scale, paying in pardons, dinners, spectacles, coins struck with your face smiling just enough to look human, not so much as to look weak. But even as you fed the people's hunger for relief, you fed your own for absolutes. You felt, as only a survivor of Capri can feel, that safety resides in altitude. Not just higher palaces and taller statues, but higher claims, above Senate, above law, above the narrow corridor where men must explain themselves. The first time someone called you a god to your face, you watched the phrase skim across the room like a swan over still water. It left no ripple. That frightened you. Divinity should not land lightly. It should break the surface. So you started to press, to test, to see what the world would bear if you leaned with your full weight. In private, you told yourself a story all prodigies whisper. I am inevitable. In public, you wore moderation precisely because you already planned to remove it. The donatives flowed, the races turned longer, the nights grew louder. The city was drunk on you, which is the only safe way to be drunk on anything in Rome. Yet when you stood alone at a balcony before dawn, the hour the house, city's marble is pink and honest. You felt the old Capri draft slide down your spine. Everything you had was a stage set, magnificent and temporary. Who builds a life on applause? Who governs thunder? So you wrote a different answer. You let priests discover omens that preferred your name. You accepted honors nobody had refused, because nobody else had dared to ask. You practiced how to stand when flanked by statues of gods, how to tilt your head so your profile mimicked their blank certainty. You were no longer surviving the empire. You were beginning to become it. Then, an invisible blade, sudden illness, a fever that made the walls warp and the ceiling breathe. Courtiers counted hours, physicians counted pulses, and the city counted all the ways it had almost lost you, when your muscles remembered strength and your voice returned from its far-off shore. The room felt tilted. Mercy looked like a costume you had outgrown. Gratitude in others looked like weakness you could not respect. Something in you had burned through. Whatever Capri had tempered now annealed into something harder, cleaner, colder. You stepped back into daylight with a new mathematics. Debts, not favors. Obedience, not affection. Certainty, not conversation. You smiled. Rome cheered. And deep in the palace, a hinge turned. The door it belonged to had no lock and no intention of closing again. Tonight, in the corridor where your footsteps keep time for the darkness, you understand the whole arc at once. The child dressed in military boots, the youth who learned to breathe underwater on an island of suspicion, the young emperor who fed the city its own sigh, the convalescent who woke with a new geometry of power. You are not a monster yet. Monsters have angles that are too easy to measure. You are something Rome has no instrument for. A man who believes survival was a trial he has already passed, and divinity the prize he is now owed. You leave the cryptoporticus and rise toward daybreak. Somewhere in that thin light, a city is about to meet the version of you it taught you to become. The first months felt like a sunrise calibrated by engineers. Every beam fell exactly where it should. You reopened temples that smelled of old cedar and older bargaining. You invited back voices the city had pushed to its margins, men whose names had become a shorthand for cautionary tales. You paid arrears to the guards, gave grain to the hungry, paraded the gods until even skeptics felt safer watching holiness on the move. Senators, who had practiced terror so long it had stiffened their spines, discovered a new motion: relief. They praised your moderation with the kind of fervor usually reserved for miracles. Perhaps it was one. Miracles, after all, are defined by what stops hurting. You understood ceremony the way a composer understands silence. Restraint can be louder than trumpets if placed correctly. You declined honors, then accepted them later with a face that told two stories at once: humility for the people, inevitability for the elite. Your coins left the mint with an almost tender profile. Your decrees came wrapped in phrases that sounded like a son calling to his city. Let us restore. Let us remember. Let us return. Even your enemies, those cautious men whose power is measured in the number of ways they can say perhaps, went home from meetings with you believing they could risk a good night's sleep. But peace is not your native temperature. It is a garment you can wear convincingly only until your skin begins to itch. The fever's aftertaste lingered. The weeks when you lay between worlds and listened to the hush of rooms that had never learned to hush. The way attendants gripped their bowls too tightly. The way Macro's shadow paused in doorways a heartbeat, longer than courtesy. Illness gave you a parable you could not unlearn. Everything depends on one body, and that body is yours. If survival is a test, sovereignty is a diagnosis. The cure for vulnerability is control. So you began to add, not laws, Rome is allergic to too much ink, but gestures that teach laws how to behave. A new emphasis in prayers, your name threaded deeper into the weave. New routes for processions, your chariot gliding where no mortal wheels had reason to roll. New costumes for holy days. Fabrics whose shimmer said loudly what inscriptions were still rehearsing sotto voce. At first the city nodded. This too is pageantry. And then it started to watch with the alertness that comes when the melody changes key and no one has told the choir. You could have stopped there, suspended in that exquisite ambiguity that lets rulers be both man and more than man without declaring either. But Capri taught you that half measures are the true danger. Men who live between definitions get defined by others. So you rehearsed your divinity in public, not as blasphemy, but as logistics. A statue goes up here, a priest adds a line there, a sacrifice acquires a new preface. You were not stealing worship, you were inheriting it. At least that's how you taught yourself to narrate the shift each night before sleep. The Senate, that patient machine of qualified assent, whirred and clacked. Some submitted as a reflex, some resisted in the precise Roman way, by raising eyebrows. Many tried to calculate how much spirit they could save while still saving their estates. You answered their arithmetic with theatre. You made Rome brighter at night than it had ever been, fed it games that ended not in dust but in a kind of choreographed astonishment. When wonders keep arriving, objections forget their lines. Then you turned, just a degree, and men who had spent their lives interpreting degrees felt it like winter. You corrected a praetor in public, and the word public ricocheted for weeks in rooms where important men digest slowly. You asked for funds without asking, and accountants discovered that ledgers can blush. You praised the gods in the mode reserved for yourself, and discovered that envy wears a priest's robe as convincingly as satin. Macro, who had lifted you the way a bridge lifts a traveller, suddenly found that bridges can be dismantled for their timber. He had always believed himself indispensable in the precise way indispensable men believe it. Not loudly, but with the confidence of carpenters who know which beams hold the roof. You reminded him that roofs can be rebuilt. Your cousin, Tiberius Gemellus, the caution built into your succession, stopped appearing at dinners, then stopped appearing altogether. Rome understood without being told. You did not need to bear. A blade. The city knows a door when it hears one close. You told yourself it was pruning, not cruelty. An orchard that feeds an empire cannot waste water on branches that shade fruit. You told yourself the city was grateful for decisions it could not admit it required. You told yourself, most dangerously, that the truth of a ruler's heart is proven by outcomes, not methods. The amphitheatre stayed full. The granaries were not empty. The Tiber continued its round-backed patience to the sea. What argument survives that list? But the mirror began to splinter in places that didn't announce themselves. A poet who had praised you for mercy suddenly wrote a line so exquisite everyone forgot it was also a map to your temper. A magistrate mispronounced a title and discovered how quickly a room can run out of air. A cavalry officer laughed at the wrong anecdote and spent the next month constructing apologies from words that never learned to kneel. None of these events mattered alone. Together, they taught the city a new reflex: be smaller when he enters. You saw the shrinking and mistook it for respect. It is the commonest imperial error. Fear is tidy. It keeps corridors quiet and schedules exact. Love is messy. It interrupts processions with petitions and bad timing. You accepted tidiness as evidence that your choreography was working. You missed the truth it was hiding. Silence is not applause. It is vacuum. On a festival day, golden and loud, you let the world see what the illness had shown you. There is no difference between for the gods and for me if the gods have learned their manners. You stood where statues usually stand, wore what statues usually wear, and required the same grammar statues require. Adoration calibrated beyond debate. The crowd complied because crowds are a technology. They convert the habits of yesterday into the horizon of tomorrow with frightening efficiency. The priests complied because careers have liturgies. The Senate complied because dignity can be simulated by not moving. Only the air refused. It tasted different that day, metallic, as if the city had bitten its tongue. When night fell, you were elated. The performance had landed. The line you had drawn between mortal and more than mortal held under the weight you put on it. Yet in the dark, the corridor spoke to you the way corridors do, with drafts and distance. You remembered Capri, the room where an old emperor had listened for footsteps that meant correction was coming. You were not old. You were not unready. But you could hear, faintly, the arithmetic other men had begun in secret. How many officers? How many doors? How many heartbeats between here and a decisive morning? You slept anyway. Power's most seductive lullaby is simple. Tomorrow will be like today, only more so. You didn't know that somewhere in that same darkness, a man who had been taught to shout victory on command was beginning to teach himself a quieter word. Not yet. Not tonight. But soon, a hinge would turn in a different corridor, and the city would discover how fast an empire can change keys. You learn the quickest way to make a city forget is to give it something brighter to look at. So you flood the calendar with games until the weeks feel shorter and the years feel generous. Morning processions teach the people how to cheer. Twilight spectacles teach them how to be grateful. You perfect the choreography of magnanimity. Call. Back in exile here. Remit a tax there. Pardon an old enemy in a way that makes his children praise you louder than he ever did. The Senate passes your proposals with the crisp efficiency of men who have remembered how to agree. Your name ripples out along Rome's roads, collecting nicknames like coins, restorer, benefactor, son of Germanicus. It all works until it begins to cost. An empire is a mouth. It eats grain and silver and attention in quantities that make arithmetic blush. The treasuries that felt cavernous in the first months now echo differently when you send your stewards down to check the levels. You could stop, reduce the games, ration the kindness. But restraint reads like weakness once abundance has learned to purr. You choose a sharper solution. Turn favors into obligations. Gifts become returns. You transform generosity into a system and then insist the system loves you back. Beneath the marble of your public voice, you refine your private math. Who owes you? How much? In what currency? Loyalty, silence, leverage. You reassign governorships not as honors, but as ledgers balancing themselves. A senator who hesitated becomes the new administrator of a province that requires long travel and longer reports. By the time he returns, the city will speak a dialect he doesn't recognize. A tribune who saluted too slowly finds his cohort rotated to a frontier where the climate is corrective. Each adjustment is small enough to explain, large enough to be remembered. You also learn a new music, the tempo of humiliation, not the crude theatrical kind that leaves stains you must later clean, but the precise kind. A pause after a man finishes speaking, long enough for him to hear the room listening, to your silence. A question asked in public that requires him to confess he doesn't know. A correction delivered without anger, as if ignorance were a coat he had simply forgotten to remove. Word travels faster than grain. Men begin to arrive at your councils. Early, breath held, answers sharpened, eyes rehearsed to look grateful even when they are only relieved. You call it discipline. Your prefects call it security. The city calls it new manners and practices them because practice is the only safe verb in a world calibrated by your moods. You tell yourself, as rulers always do, that efficiency is a form of mercy. Trials are shorter, arrests are cleaner. The ugly paperwork of accusation is replaced by the beautiful speed of understanding. Why waste ink when your gaze can sign? But the cost does not disappear. It migrates. The guard feels it first. You have replaced the man who built your staircase with men who promise to polish each step. They are careful with you, too careful, and care has a way of curdling when pay comes late and praise arrives dressed as orders. In the barracks, jokes begin their slow work. A password you chose because it amused you, a gesture you invented because it delighted you. These become a kind of currency soldiers exchange to afford their impatience. You hear none of it. You are busy teaching Rome to pronounce a new truth. The border between reverence and worship is ceremonial, not moral. You test that border with art, which is to say, with architecture. Bridges that should connect cities, connect your name to distances instead. You ask the sea to permit a game and declare victory over a god when the weather behaves. You raise temporary monuments that feel permanent because the crowds cannot imagine anything more vivid than you. When engineers say, impossible, you promote them to men who say, yes. You walk where men insist no man has reason to walk and call that reason sufficient. The nobles shrink again. They are not theologians. They are accountants. They count the ways your triumphs change the value of their prudence. A man who once measured his influence in careful sentences now measures it in careful breaths. He learns to smile with fewer teeth, to applaud with hands that never quite meet. His son learns faster. You call this progress. It looks like choreography. It is, in fact, subtraction. At night, you rehearse the argument you will never lose because you will never have to. Make it. Rome is safer. Treason is scared of daylight. The people feel seen. Bread arrives. The aqueducts hum. If your name rides inside prayers that once stopped at Olympus, that is only because Olympus misfiled your petition for too long. You have the patience of a god and the deadlines of a ruler. Why pretend there is a contradiction? One afternoon, a magistrate misreads your edge. He thinks your early humility was policy rather than strategy, and offers advice with the tone of a man who still believes in doors you must knock before entering. You listen, because listening is an art form you control, and then you watch him realize he has reached the end of a hallway he did not know was short. You do not raise your voice. You do not raise your hand. You raise his awareness of gravity, and he thanks you for it because he has children. Afterward, as you pace the same cryptoporticus where your first nights tasted of stone and distant torches, you inventory assets the way generals inventory siege engines. Grain, coin, crowds, priests, prefects, fear. Nothing leaks. Everything obeys the logic you have drawn with your footsteps. Still, the air moves strangely here, as if the corridor had learned to breathe independently of the palace above it. You tell yourself drafts are drafts. The body, however, remembers Capri. The hush that meant someone had decided something in a room you were not in. You decide to be in every room, so you widen the definition of you. Statues preface civic space with your outline. Edicts preface themselves with your tone. Priests preface oaths with your name threaded where thunder usually goes. The city nods because nodding is survival. A few men stop nodding in private because stopping, like starting, is addictive. They begin to collect each other with questions that pretend to be observations. Did you hear the password he gave us today? Did you see the way he corrected the prefect? Did you notice how the crowd looked away before they looked at him? You sleep well. The men who will change your sleep have only just remembered they have hands. You always loved stages. They tell the truth about rooms. In a theatre, everyone agrees where to look. So you make the empire a stage and cast it ruthlessly. Senators are a chorus, useful for volume, dangerous only when they discover harmony. Knights are supporting, actors, restless, hungry, eager to improvise. Soldiers are the machinery, seen only when malfunctioning. The people are the audience, your most honest critics, your least reliable allies. And you are playwright, star, patron, and critic in one body. A job description that looks plausible only when the lights are as bright as you can afford. You begin adjusting the script. Trials move from deliberation to demonstration. Why allow defendants to waste everyone's time with narratives when the empire already knows the ending? A whisper becomes a line, becomes a charge, becomes a verdict. The speed is intoxicating. You tell yourself swiftness is compassion. less agony per unit of fate. The city's heart rate drops even as its shoulders rise. Laughter, however, is not a variable you control. You thought it was, once, on the Rhine when soldiers called you Little Boots, and the nickname gilded you instead of cutting you. Here, laughter acquires teeth. It steals passwords from your mouth and returns them to you deformed. You choose, a playful word, something indelicate, a god famous for appetite, as the night's countersign, and enjoy the ripple of embarrassment that keeps men humble. It becomes a ritual. Your wit, their compliance, the city's secret. You do not see how repetition transforms jest into commentary. A tribune called Chaerea, one of those quiet professionals whose competence makes superiors think about ceilings, takes the word like an order and holds it differently in his hand. You say it again the next night, and the night after, changing the joke without changing the point. He nods. Competent men are good at nodding. You move on, as rulers must. He does not. He puts the word in his pocket and finds it later when he needs something sharp. You also turn your taste outward. Rome should look like the inside of your skull. Impossible, unnecessary, unforgettable. You fling a bridge across the Bay of Baiae with barges and arrogance, then drive across it to prove the sea is a road if you pay it enough attention. You order a campaign to the edge of the world and decide that trophies can be shells, if shells. Learn to stand for victory. You reassign the sacredness of distance. Philosophers frown. Children cheer. Merchants adjust. The Senate recalculates its size. Money complains in a language you do not respect. You answer with scarcity dressed as selection. Old families receive surprise invitations to contribute to the beauty of the age. The wealthy discover how much lighter their houses feel after your agents have persuaded their silver to serve the state. A few protest with the frightened righteousness of men who think lineage is armor. You teach them the modern material, obedience, and they reluctantly agree it is stronger. Your sisters, your household, the terrarium where every gesture multiplies, these become the mirrors that tell you what you need to hear. You pick one mirror and polish it until it reflects only your preferred angle. The city learns of your preference and decides rumors are safer than questions. You do not correct them because correction implies a standard outside your desire. Desire is simpler. It doesn't require minutes or votes. You discover fatigue in the eyes of men who used to sparkle at your entrances. You misdiagnose it as age. It is not. It is the body's natural response to unrelenting brightness. They have learned all your cues. They applaud on time. They leave the theatre relieved, not transported. You add pyrotechnics, more games, stranger ceremonies, costumes that make tradition blink. And they blink, and then the blink becomes habit. In a council where the old language of caution has been replaced by the new language of deference, a minor officer shifts his weight at the wrong moment. You notice, because noticing is your last remaining pleasure. You ask him to repeat what he just didn't say. He does, beautifully. And you smile because fear can be eloquent when coached. Around the table, men memorize the geometry of his survival. Later, they practice it in mirrors. Their wives observe the new posture and teach it to their sons. The empire domesticates itself around your temper. Meanwhile, the guard counts coins and slights, as guards do. The donative that arrived late feels smaller than the joke that arrived on time. You have asked professionals to live inside your theatre and then made them the butt of recurring gags. They carry your litter and your laughter, and it is not clear which is heavier. The prefect calculates as prefects always calculate, not what is right, but what is safe next week. His math has begun to include variables that do not have your face on them. You parade as a god and discover that divinity is less scandalous than boredom. The crowd loves you the way a crowd loves fire. From a distance, with small children held a little tighter. The applause thickens, which is not the same thing as deepening. You give the signal that once made men feel lucky to exist in the same century as you, and their response, though audible, comes back to you thin. It is the first true warning you receive, and you mistake it for bad acoustics. That night, A freedman whose job is to know everything knows a new thing. The guard has developed a habit of speaking softly together after the torch's gutter, a huddle with the geometry of intent. He brings it to you wrapped as a curiosity, expecting his usual prize for being early. You tip him, smile, and file the information beneath your pillow with all the other bedtime toys. You will look at it tomorrow. You always have tomorrow. You built the calendar. And yet, in the cryptoporticus, a place that has become a character in your life, the air writes a sentence on your skin you choose not to translate. You pass the spot without slowing. The sentence follows. You climb into a night whose stars have never failed you and feel, for the length of a single breath, as if you have misplaced something important that never belonged to you in the first place. You sleep. Somewhere not far from your bed, a quiet professional empties his pocket and finds the sharp word you gave him. He weighs it in his palm and realizes it is heavier than steel. He does not smile. He does not need to. The theatre you built has taught him all he needs to know about timing. You used to believe that Rome was a machine fueled by loyalty. Grain shipments were loyalty. Gladiatorial shows were loyalty. Gold slipped into the right hands at the right hour was loyalty. It all seemed mathematical. Feed the engine, and the engine runs. But one morning you notice the engine coughing. A centurion fails to laugh at your joke. A tribune salutes a fraction too late. An officer reports the guard's accounts with the measured tone of a man whose loyalty has gone from belief to arithmetic. You tell yourself fatigue explains it. Soldiers who have been standing too long will wobble before they fall. So you add new rewards, double the rations, increase the spectacle, yet the wobble does not stop. Instead, the wobble spreads, a rhythm carried from barracks to mess hall, from drill field to tavern. It is not mutiny. Mutiny is loud, reckless, filled with the energy of conviction. This is quieter, heavier, the slow erosion of an oath until it becomes a shrug. The truth is simple and brutal. You have trained men to measure themselves by your mood. But moods are not wages. They cannot be divided among families or exchanged for bread. When coin arrives late, laughter becomes dangerous. It risks sounding false. So the guard learns new ways to withhold. They polish armor slower. They look at each other longer before answering you. They practice the art of silence until silence itself becomes an answer, and yet you ignore it. You convince yourself that divine actors do not play to the pit. The pit should be grateful to breathe the same air. You order more games. You build more arches. You stage mock wars that cost provinces more than real ones. You climb balconies, arms raised in theatrical embrace, and hear cheers that feel practiced. You confuse practice for devotion. One evening, you pace the cryptoporticus, where your shadow has learned to pace ahead of you. You remember Capri, the sound of whispers down corridors, the sudden hush before someone's life tilted. You remember being the boy whose only defense was listening, and you realize, with a flicker of unease, that you have stopped listening. You no longer hear whispers because the whispers have moved into rooms you never enter. The first sign arrives dressed as comedy. Sherea, the tribune, whose voice is always flat, delivers your countersign back to you with the rhythm of a man who has rehearsed it too often. The joke that once made barracks erupt now hangs in the air like smoke. You laugh louder than necessary, hoping the echo will disguise the lack of audience. But laughter that must be forced is already an obituary. You begin to dream differently, not the grand processions where your name glitters like bronze across the forum, but dreams of absence, dreams in which you step onto a stage and the audience has already gone home. Dreams where you raise your hand to signal applause and hear nothing but the shuffle of sandals leaving. You wake, heart racing, certain you have miscalculated something vital. The next day you compensate. You announce gifts, coin for every man in the guard more than they expected. They cheer. It sounds almost real. But you notice how their eyes shift not toward you but toward the purses being distributed. Loyalty bought late is loyalty returned cold. You retreat into rituals. You eat standing as you once did in camp. pretending you are still the soldier emperor who sleeps beside his men. You walk the barracks at night, cloak drawn, asking questions that sound casual. But casual is not convincing when spoken by an emperor. Soldiers answer stiffly, words polished until no meaning remains. You feel the hollowness, but refuse to admit it. The theatre of obedience you built has become too perfect. Men bow in unison. They speak in chorus. They smile in the same rhythm. You should feel triumphant. Instead, you feel rehearsed. And rehearsed means they are saving their true performance for later. A prefect, loyal for years, submits a report late. Not much late. Not enough to punish, but late enough to signal that he knows you will notice. He bows deeper than ever before, as if the depth of his spine can disguise the thinness of his patience. You dismiss him with a nod and realize you have just been dismissed in return. Whispers now move faster. They are not about you, but about Rome itself. What Rome could be without your appetite. What Rome might restore if your shadow were shortened. You are still emperor. You are still God to the people. But gods die when prayers stop. And you can feel prayers drifting elsewhere. Still you play your part. You appear in the theatre. You command the games. You ride through streets lined with applause. But applause no longer fills you. It rattles. It tastes like obligation. And in the brief silence between ovations, you hear something truer. The guard counting the days. It begins like any other morning. Incense in the temples, senators rehearsing, their deference, the guard clattering through their drills. You enter the palace confident, rehearsing lines for an afternoon spectacle. You are planning a triumph of words, not swords, an oration that will remind Rome that you are both ruler and performer, both Caesar and chorus. But architecture has moods, and today, the cryptoporticus feels different. The corridor you once paced like a tamed beast now waits like a trap. Torches flicker oddly. Shadows bend at wrong angles. Your sandals scrape against stone that sounds deeper than it should. You are emperor. Corridors should never feel taller than you. The guard is present, of course. Always present. But their presence tastes different. They move too smoothly, too coordinated, as if their choreography has been practiced in a rehearsal you were not invited to. You pass them, and their salutes are perfect. Perfect is not reassuring. Perfect is a wall. Chaerea is there, standing where a tribune should stand, but his posture is less rigid than usual, his eyes less flat. He greets you with the countersign you chose. You answer automatically, expecting the usual ripple of forced laughter. The ripple does not come. Instead, silence expands, thick as stone. You keep walking, because emperors always walk forward. But forward now feels like falling. Behind you, sandals scrape in unison. Ahead of you, the light dims as if someone has taught the torches to bow. You are in your theatre, but the audience has changed. You are no longer playwright. You are the scene. A whisper cuts the silence, too low to catch, too sharp to ignore. The sound of steel leaving leather, the inhale of men rehearsing courage. You know this music. You have ordered it often enough. But music written for others sounds different when played for you. You turn, and the corridor shrinks. Men you once fed, praised, humiliated, now stand like judges whose verdict has already been signed. Their eyes do not burn with anger. They do not need anger. They burn with decision. You understand, suddenly and completely, that loyalty is not a chain, but a loan, and your payments have been late. For the first time since Capri, you feel small. The corridor is long, but not long enough to outwalk what is coming. You raise your hand, not in command but in instinct, as if gesture alone could rewind time. No one moves. The silence is absolute, a silence that means the theatre has closed. The audience has left, and the play is about to end without you. You want to speak, to summon your voice, to remind them of your divinity, your victories, your bloodline. But your throat closes. Words, the one currency you always owned, desert you. All that remains is breath, and breath is not command. The corridor has chosen its ending. The corridor is no longer stone and shadow. It is theatre. The men around you are no longer guards. They are actors who have rehearsed this moment so carefully that hesitation has been edited out of the script. You have always loved theatre, but never imagined yourself cast in the role that cannot improvise. You hear the first step. It echoes not because it is loud, but because you know it is final. Then another step, then another, until the entire corridor moves toward you with one heartbeat. The rhythm is too precise. This is not an accident. This is choreography. You taught them to rehearse loyalty with precision. They have learned to rehearse betrayal with the same discipline. A hand seizes your cloak. You twist, expecting the grip to release the moment you glare. But the grip tightens. The man does not avert his eyes. His gaze holds yours with the blunt assurance of someone who has already forgiven himself. You try to speak, some clever insult, some command to cut through doubt, but your voice collapses into silence. You realize too late that silence is the only sound this corridor will permit. Then comes the pressure, not a slash, not the spectacle you imagine when poets describe tyrants meeting their end, but blunt, unavoidable pressure. It is the world's hand pushing you down from the pedestal you built for yourself. You stagger, shocked not by pain, but by the discovery that emperors can be touched. For years you convinced yourself that divinity was insulation, but divinity proves no thicker than linen. The men around you move faster now. Some faces are grim, others almost relieved, like workers finally finishing a long, unpleasant task. They do not shout, they do not curse, they do not even look angry. They look tired, tired of applauding, tired of pretending. This is not vengeance, it is release. Your knees buckle. The corridor tilts. For one absurd moment, you think about the amphitheater, how you once laughed at gladiators who stumbled in sand, how their fall seemed almost comic. Now you are the comic relief in someone else's story. The applause you hear in your head is phantom, a memory of crowds that no longer exist. You are emperor, you remind yourself. You are Caesar, divine, eternal. But the corridor answers with a truth you cannot refute. Emperors are men until men decide otherwise. And today, men have decided otherwise. The world shrinks to torchlight, footsteps, and the iron certainty that theatre has ended. It is done. You do not know how long it took. Seconds, hours, or an eternity measured in gasps. The corridor that once echoed with the music of sandals and commands is now quiet. The only sound is the shuffle of men adjusting cloaks, wiping brows, pretending this was work and not theatre. They do not linger. No soldier wants to stand too long near the ghost of divinity. They step back into formation, faces set in the blank masks of duty. The corridor looks the same as it did before, but you feel the difference. It is no longer yours. It has been reclaimed by silence, by the empire, by history. Some men glance at each other, not at you. Their eyes say what their lips cannot. It is finished. Others avert their gaze, suddenly fascinated by walls they have walked past 1,000 times. Even betrayal prefers not to look itself in the face for too long. Then, like a tide, the palace adjusts. Servants emerge cautiously, as if testing whether the storm has truly passed. Officials whisper to each other, already debating what this means for them. Some rush to draft proclamations, others to erase names from tablets, others to measure how quickly loyalty can be reassigned. You realize something profound in this silence. Rome does not pause. Rome does not grieve. Rome does not even notice. The empire, that endless machine of grain, coin, and roads, continues without hesitation. One man may fall, even an emperor, and Rome simply edits the script. The play resumes with a new lead. Your absence is already being written. Somewhere in the Senate, men who once cheered your every word are polishing speeches condemning your reign. Somewhere in the Forum, artisans are preparing to chisel your name from monuments. Somewhere in a tavern, A drunk soldier is already rehearsing the joke he will tell about how quickly the divine can become disposable. The silence is not empty. It is full of Rome moving forward, of power rearranging itself, of history continuing as if you had never existed. For the first time, you understand what it means to be forgotten. You think endings are loud. You expect thunder, trumpets, a final chord. But the first true consequence of your absence is a hush so complete it sounds like judgment. The hush moves through corridors the way incense moves through a temple, touching everything, clinging to everyone. Doors that have never known uncertainty hesitate before opening. Sandals that once slapped the floor with confidence relearn the art of walking softly. The men who rehearsed your fall do not bask. They disperse into functions. One group secures gates, another seizes armories, a third makes for the apartments you kept closest, rooms where fear was trained to wait behind silk. Orders arrive stripped of ceremony. Seals are confiscated. Dispatch riders turned around. Scribes told to copy nothing until told to copy everything. Lamps burn lower. Fire makes men honest about what they fear. Your household learns in layers. Freedmen duck through side doors with ledgers hugged to chests. Stewards slide rings from fingers they might later disavow. The chief of the kitchens stands perfectly still, as if stillness could make a decade of menus invisible. Musicians, who once turned your mood like oars turn a ship, hide their instruments beneath blankets as though song might be indicted. Then the message no corridor wants to carry. Your wife and child will not become rival standards. The decision is executed in the same register as the rest of the morning, flat, efficient, without spectacle. In these walls, mercy is a luxury of peacetime. Today is logistics. No one carves the policy into stone. The policy travels as a look, and looks are fluent languages in palaces. Across the complex, the praetorian cohorts begin to divide themselves by appetite. Some wear the set jaw of men who think they have saved Rome. Others wear the thin-lipped worry of men who know that saving Rome and saving themselves are not the same task. A few, the most practical, start calculating numbers. How many men will back which banner? How much silver will follow which oath? How quickly a donative turns opinion from why into yes. In the Senate House, news arrives ahead of the truth, as it always does. Men who have practiced indignation in mirrors for years suddenly discover an audience. One stands to praise liberty with a voice that trembles not from courage, but from opportunity. Another suggests the Republic might at last be restored. His rhetoric lights up old statues and wakes old ghosts. Yet even as they talk, the arithmetic of the guard begins to write their script for them. Steel counts faster than syllables. Someone hisses the word camp, and the room remembers that emperors are not elected in marble, but confirmed in barracks. Meanwhile, a small, almost comic scene unfolds in a dark corner of the palace. A curtain, a breath held too long, a freedman's squeak of terror, and a figure discovered not by destiny, but by accident. Claudius, awkward, surprised, alive, stares at men who suddenly decide he looks exactly like stability. He does not deliver a speech. He delivers relief by existing. Hands that were ready to strike salute instead. The procession to the Praetorian camp is not triumph, it is a transaction walking on two legs. Back in the corridors where your perfume still clings to draperies, the conspirators measure the distance between plan and aftermath. Cassius Charia's mouth is a thin line. He has rehearsed courage, not commerce. He commanded the moment. He will not command the settlement. His comrades know this story's old moral. The blade writes the preface. Coin writes the book. They tidy their tunics, square their shoulders, and prepare to learn, again, that gratitude has a short memory and victory a short half-life. Documents are rewritten at speed. Your titles are peeled like plaster. Your likeness is weighed like scrap. The first tablet that omits your name does not crack. The first oath that avoids your prenomen does not choke the swearer. The first statue covered with canvas does not make the sun dim. People notice. The world does not end. That is how dynasties die. Not with a scream, but with paperwork that doesn't stutter. Before sunset, the palace has new traffic patterns, new passwords, new courtesies. Doors that opened inward now open out. Men who once announced you in the third person practice a different name and discover their tongues do not combust. The place adjusts with the terrifying ease of a market-changing prices. Your reign, which felt absolute while you breathed it, begins to look like what it was, a season. Seasons end. Marble keeps its temperature. And yet, within the hush, a last truth flickers for anyone who will face it. The building is not mourning you. It is mourning its habit. It will replace the habit by mourning. Word escapes the palace the way water escapes a broken jar, not in a line, but in widening circles that soak everything in reach. A muleteer hears it first at the rear gate, passes it to a grain porter, who mutters it to a baker, who tells it to a woman buying bread. 4 mouths. Later the sentence has changed tense, then tone, then size. By the time it reaches the forum, the rumour has a walk of its own and will not slow down for facts. Markets are barometers that never learn to lie. Stalls open late. Scales hover above emptiness. The olive seller folds his cloth too carefully. The fishmonger contemplates the river and decides the river can keep its secrets until tomorrow. A money changer counts the same stack 3 times and then pretends a miscount is piety. He closes for the gods. A boy chalks prices on a board and halfway through the second numeral freezes. Whatever the price is, it is wrong. The city is between numbers. You travel in these rumours like a rider in a litter, both present and unseen. Dead, says one voice with satisfaction, tasting the syllable like a date. Dead? Asks another, genuinely afraid, not for you, but for the bread that has always arrived as if by magic, and for the games that made hunger forget itself. Those who hated you never really hated the shows. Those who loved you often loved what you funded, not what you were. The distinction becomes clear the moment schedules evaporate. At the circus, a groom stops brushing a stallion mid-stroke and listens to nothing, which today is louder than trumpets. In an alley, a charioteer in green livery curses under his breath, not out of loyalty, but because uncertainty ruins wages. In a tavern near the Subura, a veteran who once cheered your brutality with professional approval now stares at his cup, as though wine might declare a successor. He does not fear justice, he fears interruption. Temples fill on a weekday, not with devotion, exactly, but with calculation in prayer's clothing. A matron lights 2 sets of candles, one for the Republic, if it returns, one for whomever the guard prefers, which is to say, for whatever the guard's treasurer prefers. Civic virtue and pay tables have always shared a bench. Today, they share a flame. Street poets who yesterday sold compliments for coppers now try out a different meter. Their couplets never mentioned your name without flattery. Now they practice condemnation that fits snugly into the same rhyme. Graffiti will follow by nightfall because walls are tides. They erase, they write, they erase again, and everyone pretends the latest inscription is forever. Messengers clatter past, their dust, more persuasive than their seals. They read decrees that avoid certain words the way careful diners avoid bones. Continuity, safety, donative, order. The city learns the new liturgy by noon. The poor do not ask who rules. They ask whether the grain ships still come down the Tiber. The shopkeeper does not ask about constitutions. He asks whether tomorrow's tax is today's tax plus a story about security. The answer, as always, depends on who sleeps in the camp tonight. You hover over the theatres you once made instruments and hear something awful and honest. Laughter. It is not the laughter of joy, it is the laughter that follows a punchline everyone saw coming, but no one dared say aloud. The jesters did not dare while you stood behind them. Now they practice courage at a safe distance from consequence. Courage has an excellent sense of timing. On the Aventine, a widow shuts her door quietly and whispers a prayer of thanks to no one in particular. In the Trastevere, a guild argues about whether debt owed to a dead man is owed at all. In the Esquiline, a child asks his father if the games will happen, and the father lies properly. Of course, of course. In the Campus Martius, young men toss javelins with the fierce concentration of people who suspect they may be needed sooner than they hoped. By afternoon, the city reaches its verdict, not in words, but in posture. People stand a fraction straighter, because fear always compresses the neck and speculation, strange medicine, briefly unwinds it. But they do not celebrate in the streets. Rome has learned to wait between breaths. The guard will announce a name. The Senate will discover that it agrees. Priests will approve the discovery with appropriate theatre. Then the people will decide whether to cheer. They will almost certainly cheer. Bread tastes the same under new signatures. You wanted the city to stop when you stopped. It does not. It blinks. It updates. It makes room for the next inscription on the triumphal list of men who learned too late that Rome's true religion is continuity. Your statues will not stand long. Their niches already measure a successor. The only monument you keep is the rumour of you, and rumour, like smoke, suggests fire without warming anything. By dusk, the streets are loud again. Hawk calls, wheel ruts, children, bargaining, the thousand hisses of a city refusing to be a single story. Night will write graffiti and oaths. Morning will pretend they were always there. Somewhere, a crier rehearses a proclamation that does not mention you. Somewhere else, a soldier practices shouting another man's name. You are not the first to learn this lesson, and Rome intends you will not be the last. The city loves its emperors the way the sea loves ships, enough to carry them, not enough to miss them.